Hello, everyone. My name is Susanne Reber. I want to welcome all of you. I want to thank you for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar. And this webinar today is on investigating sexual abuse. As I said, my name is Susanne Reber, and the executive producer of podcast at Scripps, DC Bureau. Scripps is a US media company, but I've been an investigative journalist and editor for many years. And I've also been a long and proud member of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. In fact, I went to some of the earliest conferences we all had. And I just want to say I've learned so much from colleagues all over the world. We're all dedicated to helping each other as we do investigative work. And so in terms of relevance to this day and this webinar, I'm also the executive producer of a show called Verified. It's an investigative documentary podcast series. And season 1 of Verified, it told a story about a serial sexual abuser in Italy and the survivors from all over the world, the women who banded together to bring him to justice. Over the years, I've led I-teams at CBC, NPR, and I've started several investigative shows, one Reveal and the other Verified, entirely to create homes for investigative reporting and documentary work. So I feel really privileged today that I get to introduce you to some incredible investigative reporters from all over the world who've put their hearts and souls into working on one of the trickiest aspects of power to cover. You all know in the past few years, sexual abuse has been firmly put on the agenda for journalists. In 2017, we all heard the Me Too hashtag. It went viral, and it followed the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse allegations and all of the other investigations that followed. And women around the world really called out abuse, and they started speaking up. So today, the webinar, the GIJN webinar, is going to focus on investigating cases of sexual abuse that take place in times of peace. So that means we're not going to be looking at rape in conditions of war or mass conflict, which are very important issues, or partner violence or domestic abuse. I mean, there's many more webinars we could have on those subjects, but today we are going to focus on how we can investigate patterns of behavior of abusers and also the patterns of institutional negligence or complicity that are part of our society. I mean, the statistics on this are kind of depressing. Cases of abuse are mainly by men against women. Most are never reported to authorities. And the level of convictions all over the place is really low. And yet we hear that, should we believe these women? The actual fact is there's a very low incidence of false claims, despite all the hype that we hear from media and public officials. But at the end of the day, this is a topic that still is super taboo among many people in the world. And that's why so much of it goes unreported. But today, the journalists that you're going to meet, Lenaïg, Sophia, and Ashwaq, they really have been digging deeper into all of the sexual violence. And we're going to hear from them today in a few minutes on what it takes, the rigorous investigative journalism, the standards, but also just as important, the commitment, and I would say the additional skills that it takes to deal with the trauma of survivors, to deal with some of the tricky parts of dealing with editors or societies that really might not want these stories to get out. So like I said, our journalists are covering the globe. We have Lenaïg from France, we have Sophia joining us from China, and we'll have Ashwaq joining us from Kashmir. And so I'm going to just welcome everybody again. Just before we jump off to our speakers, I just want to just remind you a little bit about the Global Investigative Journalism Network. If you're not familiar with GIJN, it's the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations around the world. We have 203 member organizations in 80 countries, but we work with journalists everywhere in nonprofits, commercial organizations, and also with freelancers. And if you've ever been to the Global Investigative Journalism Network website, you'll know that we have like an extensive range of resources, tip sheets worldwide. And in fact, very soon, there's going to be a new reporting guide on investigating sexual abuse, which is what we're talking about today. And it's going to be published on Monday, the 23rd of November. And it's also going to include tips that are coming out of this webinar. So without further ado, I really would like to now introduce our speakers and then hand them over the mic. They will each give short presentations, around 8 minutes each or so, and we'll have one question each and we'll move on to the next speaker. So first up, I'd like to introduce you to Lenaïg Bredouxi. Lenaïg is a gender editor at Mediapart, one of France's leading independent media outlets. And she's been covering gender-related issues and sexual violence for almost a decade. Before that, she was an economic journalist at AFP, and she followed social issues at UMA. And she's also the co-author of Tunisian Connection, an investigation into Franco-Tunisian networks under the longtime President Ben Ali. So welcome, Lenaïg. I would like to hand it over to you, and perhaps you can start your presentation. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. I will try to be as clear as I can when I'm speaking in English. What's not always easy for me, but I'm gonna try it. First of all, I would like just to try to launch my PowerPoint, but I don't know if it's going to work. First, I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it? You can see it. The first point is that I wrote and edited a lot of investigative pieces on sexual abuse for a decade, as Susan said it. And it was in very different environments, in very different places on politics. I used to be a specialist in politics too, and in universities, in the movie industry, in French newspapers or French TV channels. And based on this experiment, I will try to tell a few things. And first of all, and how I think we have to collect evidence in the context where I'm working. First thing is that some people, even journalists, are still saying that investigations on sexual abuse are almost impossible because there is no evidence, but it's wrong. That's true. It can be difficult because you don't have Excel documents on bank accounts or leaks about tax fraud, for example. But I always used to say that you can have documents, you have to seek them. Examples, you can have text messages, you can have emails, WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagrams, all the social medias have inboxes. You can sometimes get voice messages, you can find letters, diaries, you can get pictures, for example, to prove, for example, that the protagonists have known each other. Victims or survivors very often delete their messages with the man who abused them. And very often too, they have spoken about it to someone, to their boyfriends, to their girlfriends, to their parents or families or best friends, or to one coworker. Even when they think nobody knows, it's very, on my experience, very exceptional that they never told someone. And even if they did not deliver all the details, often they said, okay, I got a problem with him. And you can find messages in which they speak about the abuse with another person. And other example, if you have a lawsuit, if you have a procedure at work, if you have a complaint in a university or in an administration, you can find documents too. The victims made testimony. You can sometimes get it. It's an official document. It has some value. And you can find proof that the victim already delivered the same story to someone else. And you can prove that someone else already knew. It's very important then. Example, if I try to give an example, I used to write several investigative pieces on sexual abuse in French universities. And for this one, I only used testimonies coming from disciplinary procedures who are mostly ongoing. And what I did is that I got in touch with the students or professors who testified to get their approval. I could use what they said. And I have interviewed the administration of the university and found sources there who were terribly angry about impunity. And that's the reason why I could then release my story. Other key point, the number of victims and the number of witnesses. On my experience, the very, very difficult investigation is the one about an abuse in the past, for example, for 10, 15, 20 years ago, with no witnesses still alive or connected to the survivor, and with only one declared victim. It's very difficult in that case. It is possible, and I have an example. The French actress Adèle Haenel and the great investigation led by my colleague from Mediapart, Marine Turki, was released into 2019, but she gets a lot of documents at witnesses quoted by their name. It's an exception. More often we succeed when we have several victims, because it makes the story credible, and because it's often drawing a pattern. Example, when I investigate the case of the former vice president of the French Parliament, we could run the story in 2016, because we had first 8 victims, among them 4 on the record. And other example, when we released a story about the filmmaker Luc Besson, our first story was based on 4 women complaining about his attitude. Almost as much is important as the number of victims, it is the number of witnesses. The people we say we saw something, who heard something, who can describe the environment. And just at that point, I would like to say that when we speak about sexual abuse, sexism is really important. I mean, if the presumed abuser is sexist, made often jokes about women, remarks about their clothes, etc., it's not a proof of the abuse, but it's an element that can lead you to say, okay, maybe this man has really a problem with women. And I just want to say another thing very clearly. In these investigations, victims are the survivors. They are the heroes, but men are very important, and they are very often witnesses. They heard something, they spoke with the abuser, they can confirm the sexism, for example. So this point is not only, the point is not only that women should speak out, they speak, we just don't listen to them enough, but men too, they can break the silence, as we say. They can break the silence and they can help. And it's very important as journalists to have this point in mind, because sometimes we don't think about it, to ask them what they say. And really, on my experience, it's really good witnesses that can help and can lead to us to release the story at the end. And to come to the other point, I often am asked if there are major differences between investigations on sexual abuse and other investigations. And in fact, they have a lot in common. We bring facts with sources. So that's journalism. But there is a main difference, and is the fact that the sources are victims or survivors. It creates a very special relationship. You have to keep some distance because you have to lead an investigation, because you have to check every detail. You have to doubt something sometimes. You have to collect evidence. That's our job as journalists. But above all, until the story is not released. But survivors give you something very special: their confidence, their lives, their pain. And it's a huge responsibility for us. And so we have to speak with them in a special way, I think. First, we have to say them how it's gonna work. We have to say that it will last. The investigations on sexual abuse are often very long. They last often several months. Example, my colleague on Adèle Haenel, it was 7 months. My story on a French politician, it was 2 months. My story about a university, 4 months. With another colleague. For the survivors, it's very difficult because when they decide to tell their stories to a journalist, then they hope it will change something in their lives. It will bring justice, and they want it quickly. That's normal. But we, as journalists, we need time to investigate. So you have to explain that, on my opinion. You have to say at the beginning, I have to tell you, it will be long, it will be hard for you. I'm not sure that I'm going to succeed. You have to explain your work. You have to explain how we collect evidence. You have to say, okay, I believe you, but it's not the point. It's not enough. I need to make my job. I need to collect evidence in order I can write it. And you have to explain why we need confidentiality as long as possible, because sometimes I want to tell everyone that they spoke to a journalist, and you need a little bit space or time to collect the evidence, and you need for that confidentiality. And why you have to explain to why at the end you have to interview the man they are accusing, because sometimes they don't understand that point, don't understand why you have to do that. And it's very violent for them that you have to call him, to see him, to ask questions, and to write it in the story. You have to tell them before that it's going to be written in the story. That's what I think too. And we have to be careful because survivors are afraid, and everywhere, in every place I have investigated, in politics, at school, in newspapers, everywhere. And they are right to be afraid because they are victims, because sexual abuse is a matter of domination and a question of power. So they are right to be afraid. But so you have to take care of that. You have to be careful with that. And just a little last word, when the story gets published, you have to catch up. That's what I think. You have to keep in touch. You can't just say, hey, bye now, I made my job and I don't see you anymore, because reporting can be very violent too. The fact that you release a story can be a new violence for the survivor. Example, you can write a new story a few weeks or a few months after, asking that if the investigation changed anything in their lives, if the investigation had consequences, if it brought a new law or new measures in a firm, for example. It can be helpful for the survivors, and I think very helpful for the public.
Lenaïg, thank you so much for all of that detail. That was incredibly impactful, certainly for me. I was reading one of your stories, one that you did with colleagues, and there was a quote that struck me. I said to myself, at last someone is speaking, right now I'll do so too. You mentioned earlier how you can get evidence in a case where we often think there is none. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you can persuade survivors to give up some of their most personal details, like you said, the text messages, the videos, the stuff on their phone that we often hold so dearly? How do you approach survivors to speak about something so intimate?
I'm not sure I have the right recipe or if I do it the right way every time, because sometimes I think we always do some mistakes. But what I can say is that if you explain every step of your work, it's the best way to convince them to help you for that. For example, to get the messages, even they are negative. For example, sometimes they don't want to give emails or messages because sometimes, and very often, they answered because sometimes they played with that because they didn't know how to react in front of the harassment, for example. So they are sometimes hesitating, saying, okay, but it's going to be negative for me. And you have to say, okay, you know, if you don't do that, I can understand it's very, very difficult to do that. But if you want me to release the story, I need that, and I need that, and you need that, because the abuser will give me the messages, will use them.
Use them against you, right?
Exactly. Right. And so if you explain why you do something, on my opinion, it's the best way to get the confidence and to respect this confidence, and the fact that they give you so much when you are when you explain every step.
Thank you. So next up, I'd like to introduce Sophia. Sophia is another really determined, I would say, investigative journalist. She's an instrumental part of the Me Too reporting in China. She's looked at 3 of the top cases of Chinese top universities that were on the front lines of the Me Too reporting. She's also, unlike many journalists, had to face some pretty severe consequences for her reporting, and has faced been in jail, and that's not what we'll talk about today. But I just want to introduce Sophia as somebody who, obviously, when she puts her mind to it, really is very strong in her reporting. So I don't want to take too long with the introduction, but Sophia, perhaps you can start your presentation and tell us more about the work that you've done. And you might have to unmute yourself if you are muted. I'm not sure. I can't hear you right now. Sophia, can you hear us?
Yep.
All right.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Great. So
thank you, Susan. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. So hi, everyone. My name is Sophia. I'm from mainland China. I'm an independent journalist. So I have actually been reporting sexual abuse since 2016. So I do have some lessons or experience to share. To begin with, I would like to share 2 reports. The first one report is I did it in 2017. The report is on the workplace sexual harassment, and I actually reached like among 416 women journalists, and you can see that 83.7% of them has said that they have been sexually harassed before. And you know, the numbers who filed the case is only 3.2%.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, you were breaking up quite a bit.
Sorry.
So I'm not sure if it's your headset.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's better. All right, keep going. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but we couldn't hear you. So.
Okay, sorry, maybe it's my Wi-Fi is not strong enough. So
You're
sorry.
Sounding great.
As you can see on my, PPT, like that's the data. That's the study I launched in like 2017. So this is actually study among all these journalists, and you can see that 61.3% of them blame the institutional failure. They said they don't want to report or file the case.
Sophia, when you were holding it, was
sure. Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. So you can see that like not a lot of journalists, even journalists who are more resourceful or more vocal about those violence and abuse and the power structure, but they don't want to go public. I talked to 89 of them. I got the detailed story, but they don't want, only 3 of them says that they can go to public and using their real name, which I understand perfectly why they don't want to, because they're so afraid that it will affect their personal life and everything will be affected. And in another survey that is like over 6,000 college students, they had 70% of them says that they had been sexual abused before in campus. Why I share these 2 reports? Because it shows you the prevalence of the sexual abuse in mainland China, of course, in the workplace and the campus. So that's a very serious thing, but people just keep silence about it. And I tell a lot of friends, a lot of survivors, it's one thing to share your story with me privately. It's another thing that you want to go to public and using your name to name those accused. So here comes some tips, maybe useful tips. I'm not sure. So first tip number 1 is you have to. Hi.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna.
Oh my God.
I know, it's so sorry. Why don't you just take off your headset? Let's try again, because earlier when we did the rehearsal, I could hear you great, and that way we can really hear what you'd like to tell us. So let's try that. Just if you can just take off your headset and just take it out. Let's see if we can just try it with your computer audio, and hopefully we can continue and let you speak. Yeah, that's much better. If you just take out, sorry about that, but we couldn't hear you.
Okay, sure. So should I start it with the slide 2, the number 1? Okay, I would like to share some useful tips, maybe useful tips for you. So first one is like you need to get the trust and tell the risk. What I mean is like you get the trust, you had to really share them, your personal story. That's how I reach survivors. I tell them what I have been through, what I suffer, and I will tell them how exactly I'm going to do the investigation. Like I need to talk to their friends, their colleague, and the roommates, anyone that has shared the story before. And I also will tell them the risk. The risk is like if you go public, people might blame you. They are slut shaming everywhere, and they might check all your information. They might expose your personal life. So I will tell them the risk and help them to prepare for what will come after they go public. And then when I told them this, they will trust me more, and then we can go together for the next step. So the tips number 2 is you had to avoid victim blaming, slut shaming. Like I will raise questions under the context to understand the structural factor of the abuse. And you don't raise questions like why you don't stop him, why you don't call the police. I don't raise questions like that. I will raise questions like what stops you or what prevents you from going to police. And I don't ask why you don't do this, because I don't question the survivors for not doing enough. I will question the system, question why the society, why our system did not provide enough support for you to come forward, for you to really share your story. So you question the law, you question the police station, you question the university, the workplace, why they don't provide enough support for you. So that's the question I will use. And then you need to respect the survivor. Why respect is very important. You have to be patient because a lot of them really suffer from guilt, humiliation, shame. They are traumatized. They might not be willing to tell you all the details. And you have to wait to be patient, to respect their choice. They might go forward and backward sometimes. So you wait until they are really ready to do it. And when they're ready to show the details with you, you have to avoid portraying the story in a as a sex scandal or in a sensational way. You don't portray that. You have to avoid sensationalize the sexual abuse as a sex scandal or just try people to just arouse all those curiosity or sexist stereotypes. So you had to avoid doing that. And then for the tips number 4 is I do a lot of cross check. You need to cross check all the source and the stories. That means you had to interview as much people as you can, like their colleagues and their friends, their families, and the accuser too. You also need to talk to them because you need to balance the story. It's not like one side story against another side story. And then you need to have to really do very careful job to collect the evidence, like read the emails, text message, photos, audio recordings, and CCTV clips. I mean, you go to visit the place where alleged abuse was happening. And I was lucky every time I went to the university or went to the place they said that's the sexual harassment or sexual abuse happened. I come forward, I met a lot of witnesses at that time. And then some of them share the CCTV clips with me. I get the copies. So those all agrees with the story of the survivor. That's very helpful. But that comes to how you really get the trust to give you all these very private, very intimate messages, because I will share them. That's how I do it. I trust you, but you also need to persuade people to trust you too, especially the audience when you go to public. And the last thing is get a lawyer. That's very important. Since I am a freelance journalist in mainland China, I need to make sure that there's no legal issue in all these reportings. So get a lawyer, and then David, the lawyer will chat and give you some advice. It's very important in mainland China, especially, you know, we don't have a detailed law about sexual harassment to give a very specific definition about sexual harassment. And, you know, there's a lot of cases. Just yesterday, there's one case of one girl, the survivor, and a friend helping her to spread the news about sexual harassment was brought to courts yesterday. So the accuser was brought to court for defamation. That's the case happening in mainland China. There are a few. So after all these tips, I would like to share the Me Too movement in mainland China. That's like one of the biggest challenge for all these survivors to come forward is the state censorship. I mean, you know, in mainland China, something is very tricky. Everything risks provoking widespread outrage or any collective action is under strict monitor and surveillance in China, since the government's main concern is safeguard stability. So, you know, and this Me Too movement is become a social movement. A lot of survivors are inspired and empowered to speak forward. I remember in 1 month in July 2018, there are 23 cases popping up in 1 month. So you see women coming forward to share their story and demanding for the change of the law, for the change of this patriarchy society, for the change to respect women from the bottom of heart. So that is a social movement in mainland China, and that triggered the censorship. All the articles, even the survivors' testimony, everything was censored and deleted in the internet overnight. So it's becoming very difficult for the survivors to come forward. You know, when the government label Me Too movement, label all these survivors coming forward as a threat to national security. And we did actually, a lot of survivors, including me, journalists, are getting calls from the national security police telling us not to do this interview, not to come forward, like you are being used by the foreign evil force. So you need to be careful. We did get a lot of threats from the government. So you can see for survivors here in mainland China, like we had to fight with the perpetrators, fight with the law, fight with the failed systems. What I mean is like, we don't have enough hotlines or women's organization or social workers who really understand sexual abuse, and we don't have this anti-sexual harassment law. And we need to fight with this patriarchy society, really discriminate women. Even we said that women hold up half of the sky for 50 years, but still people doesn't really respect women's will. And we had to fight with the authoritarian government. So that's all those things challenging survivors to come forward. I think I might just share all these. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. That was excellent. I have a question for you. You raised at the very beginning this idea of how, you know, and also I think Lenaïg mentioned it too, that these are very long stories. They go on for a long time. People are really having to give up very intimate details. You talked about the ups and downs. In our investigation, we talked a lot in our team about ongoing consent, you know, that survivors can, it's not a one-time transactional thing, that it's something, that relationship that goes on for a long time. Can you talk to us a little bit, especially given the pushback and pressures that you face in your political context? How do you make sure, or how do you ensure that you're you know, working with the survivors to make sure that that they're still giving their consent for the stories?
Actually, most of the time, I really be very patient. I give them as much time as they want. Even I finish all my investigation work, finish my article, I don't publish it yet. I will wait for a few weeks, like, are you ready for this? And when I cross-check all those facts, I will also make sure that I will give them my direct code. Is this correct? When you are saying this, am I understand you perfectly? And I misunderstand this or that. And I will use these details to question the accuser.
There you are.
It's like,
yeah, it was breaking up. I was just gonna.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna play back what you were saying, that you're just incredibly patient with your sources and your survivors, and you keep an ongoing conversation going. And I think that's a super helpful reminder that, again, we're not, these stories are not transactions, they are ongoing relationships. So thank you, Sophia. I'm gonna move on, and I would love to introduce you all to Ashwaq Masoodi. She's going to be speaking to us about her investigations, and something that struck me just reading some of your work, Ashwaq, is in your context, one woman is raped, I think you had in one of your articles, in the country every 15 minutes. So we're talking about a systemic issue. And on that note, I just want to hand it over to you quickly on how do you do your work, given the context that you have in Kashmir.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, GIJN. I'm happy to be here. I have been a journalist for almost a decade now, and I've reported from 22 out of 28 Indian states. Most of my reporting has been from small towns and villages in India. And even though I have written extensively on different social inequalities across the country, my work on gender hasn't really just been about violence against women. My work has also been around issues of sexual rights of women with disability, gender-based discrimination at workspaces, also about decoding female sexuality and how it's imagined and experienced in rural spaces. But before describing my work in particular or around sexual abuse, I would want to also give a little overview of India to sort of give you a context of where my work has been happening. So the laws in India and the conversations around sexual abuse and rape changed dramatically after 2012, which was when a 23-year-old student was gang raped and killed aboard a private public bus. Even though Indian, the country isn't particularly, rape or sexual abuse isn't something that people aren't aware of, this particular case kind of shook the conscience of the Indian, average Indian reader, because of multiple reasons: the profile of the victim, and also the way newspapers and news channels kind of wrote about this incident, and the way the very gory details of how metal rods were inserted into the woman and how they were pulled out with so much force that her intestines came out were headlines that were splashing all over. So because of that, a very large cross-sectional protest, series of protests came up in the national capital and across the country. But that also led to complete change in the Indian law on rape. At the moment, the law on rape and sexual abuse on paper is extremely progressive in India. And in fact, to just give an example, finger insertion without consent is considered to be rape by the Indian law. So, but you know that on paper things can be as rosy as we want them to look, but then the reality is very, very different. So India is known to be like one of the most dangerous places for women. One woman is raped in the country every 15 minutes. Around 100 cases of sexual assault are reported to the police in the country every single day. Conviction rates, you can read about it. So within all of this context, violence against women needs to be understood in a certain way, which is what we as journalists have been trying to do, is that violence against women is not just about crime per se. In the Indian context, it's intertwined with class hierarchy, with caste hierarchy, with imbalance, which is related to religion or sects. And it's also, there's an added element of honor, which is associated to the to the body of the Indian woman. So protecting that honor, losing the sense of dignity, if you lose honor, is something which is a very intrinsic part of what is happening of violence against women in India. So within this context, within all of this, reporting on sexual abuse has really received a lot of attention in the recent years in the Indian media. But most of it is either sensational, you'll have photographs like these, it's very urban centric, it is definitely way more biased towards or against several social classes. And it's also very filled or obsessed with the Victorian idea of rape, which is like the stranger danger rape, wherein the statistics are very clearly showing that 99% of cases, the abuser is someone who is known to the victim. So, or unless something gory comes up, or unless something like really details like intestines being pulled out comes up, rape or sexual abuse doesn't necessarily find a lot of space in media. So definitely not front page. Rape maybe once in a while, but sexual abuse, not at all. So most of these stories are tucked away as everyday crime stories in papers. So what a few of my colleagues in the Indian media landscape and I have been doing over these years is trying to fill this gap. So unlike the other speakers, or other two speakers, I haven't investigated sexual abuse cases per se, but instead I've dug deep into patterns. I've dug deep into patterns of criminality, patterns of behavior, the reason behind particular geographical spread of crimes. So basically I've focused more on whys rather than the whats. Just to give an example, in 2018, October 2018, just when the Me Too movement kind of picked up in India, I tried to look into the cases of the sexual abuse cases that had gone to the courts. So just to understand what exactly happens when what happens when Me Too goes to court. I started out with the story of a woman working in a Delhi government organization, and she had filed a sexual harassment case against 3 of her colleagues in 2001. She was working in this organization where there were 50 men and around 15 women were working there. And in this office, for some reason, men consumed alcohol during the workday and also played cards during breaks. It was absolutely normal to see, figures of naked women drawn on the bathroom walls, or even the figures of male private parts were sort of traced on the dust-laden tables. And as I've written as well, and even though all of this was happening around and everyone sort of had accepted it as a normal, she also did not speak up till this kind of became very personal. One day, someone had intentionally placed a deck of playing cards with sex positions imprinted, different sex positions imprinted on it. which and also a random series of numbers, which she found out was a vulgar tongue twister in Hindi, which translated into rape. So what she did is she complained to her seniors, who dissed it completely, saying that, but what is the problem there? They're just being funny. It's a joke. You're really overthinking, and you need to completely, oh, at least you've not been raped, which is something that keeps people popping up in most of the sexual harassment cases. At least you've not been raped. So after she filed the case with after the seniors completely ignored what she said, she filed the case with the police. She was cross-examined for 7 years. There were several hearings that took place. 10 to 15 judges were changed in the process. 17 years later, which is when I'm doing the story, 2018, the court convicts one of the accused in one of the cases. The rest are still going on actually. So her story at that time, the reason why I'm bringing it up is it gives the context of how things operate there. And also that while her story sounded tragic in terms of the time it took, in terms of what happened in the process, in terms of how nothing really happened to the accused, and on the other hand, the victim had to go through a lot, one of the biggest challenges that we as journalists, and I particularly in this case faced, was that I know Lenaïg said that people generally say there's no proof, but there is proof. In such cases, to find proof when there's no paper trails has been a big challenge, at least for me when I've been covering. And also one of the biggest challenges that I think I have faced is to know how to balance between empathy and also to stick to my commitment to verifying facts. I know that at this incident, the tragic incident that's happened to the woman has sort of robbed away her agency. And the least I can do is to give her some sense of returning that, taking away that agency, giving her back the agency, which could be with something as simple as letting her decide when she wants to talk, letting her decide where she wants to talk, letting her stop when she wants to stop. So a lot of it has mostly been me trying to find the balance, which is really thin. And I know that I cannot tiptoe around the issue, but I have to also remember that there is every possible reason for her to not speak to me because the system is particularly against her. But apart from that, in such cases, what we see, which also Sophia mentioned a little, is that there are, in this case as well, there were several contradictory accounts that she was bringing up, that 58-year-old was bringing up. One day she would say something, the other day it was something else. And in a general crime story, or even in like any other story that we do, we generally tend to, you tend to doubt the person who's speaking. But initially that was my instinct. Like I would always be like, oh, okay, that was my instant reaction that, oh, she's lying or she's, hiding something. But in these cases, it's been extremely useful to remember that trauma does change the way your memory works. It has an impact, and undergoing trauma does impact the way you remember things. And that the fact that there's there are contradictory accounts is not in any way an evidence of deception of any sorts. You need to ask tough questions, but that's what our job is. As journalists, we have the liberty of sounding stupid and ignorant, and we can constantly ask questions. And that's what we do. And that's what helps in these cases as well. But one thing which I think is extremely important is how we define them, and definitions matter, and how we portray them and what has happened to them. So like in the South Asian context, it really is something that I think is, as journalists, is something that we have to be very particularly sensitive about, is that you cannot call rape non-consensual sex. You cannot, even if you try to be like, when you're trying to balance, you cannot use these words. Rape has nothing to do with sex. It only has to do with power. You have to be very clear about it. And then there are things like, you cannot, eve teasing is a term that the Indian public, in the public sphere, the term that's used for sexual harassment is eve teasing, or a sexual harasser is called a road Romeo. So you have to be very particular about it. You have to let the and also if you have a chance, ask the survivor how she wants to describe what has happened to her. In some way, let her pick the words that fit her, the descriptions that fit her, rather than you deciding on her behalf. And then in the end, I would just say that, reporting on sexual harassment really does not just require, as journalists, we are required to have the nose for the news. It's not just that. It's a combination of it's a combination of compassion. It's a combination of being really, really, you have to have a thick skin. You have to, you're basically you're trying to get answers when you know that probably you would get nothing. But you also have to have empathy. You also have to have the sensitivity. You also have to understand psychology of a human being. You also have to respect them. So I feel like this is that you're writing about a very personal issue, but you know that you're writing because the personal issue is a public concern. So a lot of it is just a combination, which I think is not something that, like you cannot fake empathy. You cannot trick them into speaking something, saying that it's, it's for your own good. I think one thing that really helps me while doing these stories is to constantly remind myself that it's them doing a favor on me and my readers by telling their story, and not the other way around, because that really helps me in respecting their right to choose, right to say no, and their choices. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwaq. I think you brought up some really interesting points, and especially as you said that you're really looking for the patterns. In our own investigation, of course, we had multiple victims who had also been drugged, and so there was an issue of the abuser knowing that they couldn't really necessarily remember. But by looking at the pattern of the multiple patterns of the ways that these patterns repeat themselves, in itself gives the survivors power, because they recognize. But also in our case, it was actually the prosecutor going to court with a pattern, which I thought was really interesting. So given what you were talking about, and thank you so much for talking about the agency issue, I think that's super important. But I'm also wondering, given that you are focusing so much on the patterns, can you talk just a little bit about some of the patterns that you have found through the case studies that you've done? What are the primary patterns, if you had to name 3 or 1 even?
Well, something which I think has been really interesting is I once did a piece on why men rape. That was predominantly because I was really disturbed by it. So I spent a lot of time with rapists to just sort of understand how they work and, why they do what they do. But one of the things that I remember from then is they're in complete denial. No one says that they've done it. They've admitted to the crime elsewhere, but then here, when you meet them, they're like a normal human being you see everywhere in the bus or a metro. But the way people have a way of justifying their crime is also something I find very fascinating. They have a way to justify whatever they did, whether it's blaming the woman, whether it's blaming, his own circumstances or what pushed him. So I feel like I find criminality very fascinating, but I also think that it's the way they look at rape is, I remember this one conversation that I had with a woman who is from the lower caste, the untouchables among in the Hindu hierarchy, the lowest. She said, how is it that they have a problem in touching me, but they do not have a problem in raping me? Rape is, for her, it seemed like something, there's a very intimate connect between two people if they do, even if it's with power and not exactly with. She said, how is it that happens? These are very small, specific patterns that come when I see that men react a certain way. Then I see, okay, this is happening in particular areas. Why is it happening? What context were these men brought up in? And of course, the backstory does explain a lot of what people are doing now.
So I think at this point, we're going to open the floor. I know that Eunice, our colleague, has been collecting questions that are that we'd love to try and see how many we can answer. We're also, I think we've got a lot of questions coming your way. So Eunice, do you want to take us through some of that so we can see?
Thank you everyone for asking your questions. There's a lot, so let's try to get to as many of them. The first one is about source. The first batch of questions is about sourcing. So Julie Dufresne is asking all panelists, how do you work your investigation when you get a tip from someone who heard stories or have been told stories, but the victims or the survivors don't want to talk to you even off the record? So in relation to that, Josie and Ivel both asked, how do you start looking for survivors willing to speak? Do you wait for them to reach out to you, or do you actively try to locate them and contact them? Anyone wants to start? Lenaïg?
Yes, okay, thank you. So if for the first question, I think it's not possible if the survivors refuse. In fact, it's a limit. In fact, you can try to convince them. You can explain why it can be important, how you can do that, how you can protect their identities, for example, and not release their names. But if they don't want to talk to a journalist, and if they don't want to see their stories released, you can't do that. You just can't do that. And that's the point. It happens sometimes. Sometimes I had to say, okay, I have to give up because they don't want, or one doesn't want and the others are okay. But if one doesn't want, you have to respect it. It's an absolute rule. And for the other question, it's very often like that. Someone say, okay, I heard something. Maybe you should look in this area. You should ask X or this woman or this man. And it's how it begins. It's how you have the first sources are sometimes indirect. It's not very often that the victims called you and say, okay, I'm a survivor and I would like to tell my story. It happens, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's someone else who is shocked, who is angry, and we said, okay, it's not possible. You have to do something. You have to write a story. And then, okay, progressively you get a new source and a new source and a new woman and a co-worker and a friend or a family and and you have other elements to have enough to say, okay, I can release my story. That's how it works, in my opinion.
Hi, Alicia, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, for me, I did a few reports before, so I used my reports to reach the survivors. After they read my report, actually later, they approached me to share their story. And then sometimes I also work with some female women organization who support the survivors. I will talk to them like, this is how I'm going to do the reports, what kinds of people I will talk to. Like I will send them all those, I also will send them some successful cases happening in the United States, in Japan, in France, in different countries. So it's kind of like, it's not persuade them to talk about it. It's just empower them. I mean, when they read all those stories, they get empowered and inspired. And when they are ready, I think most of them are willing to talk when they are ready. You just need time and tell them you will go to attack them and share the risk with them all together. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to add a little to it. With a specific case that, there was a woman, a teenager who was raped and also sexually abused by a self-styled godman Asaram in India. And when I did a story on her, unlike the case of the woman, like the 58-year-old who initially declined, but I kept insisting for like a week. We kept going back and forth, and eventually she gave up. And she said, we'll meet, but I'm not giving you my word that I'll speak to you. She wanted to see whether she can trust me. So I went, shut my notebook, did not open my recorder, nothing, and just had a chat with her. And we spoke for an entire day after that. But in the other case, which was a teenager, apart from the fact that, we don't reveal, the Indian law doesn't permit revealing the name of the survivor victim. But in this case, even though I spent a lot of time with the family of the woman, and I also did spend, I was on a tight deadline. Despite that, even though I was there and I was just sitting right in the adjacent room, I mean, where in the adjacent room, the teenager was there, I knew it, she declined to speak to me. And this is where, like in the case of the 58-year-old, I knew that I had to push. Here, I knew I had to stop. I knew there was no way I had to go ahead with it. So in accessing people, I generally go through lawyers or NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that are working, because it becomes easier, or if it's someone who someone knows. So there's some layer of familiarity there, which I have to sort of seek.
Eunice, you're muted.
Yes, thanks. Thank you everyone for your answers. This question is for Lenaïg specifically, from Julian Loeffler. Sometimes it is simply not possible to keep in touch with victims after publication, even though it's important. Because in the last story she did, she was in touch with about 50 survivors, and she also needed to move on to new resources for new stories. So when and how, in your experience, is a good way to end working with sources? And the second question is for Sophia. Mongchimek, she said that your point on questioning the system and not the victim, and also avoiding victim blaming and slut shaming, was great. So what kind of resources help you to get there?
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure I have the answer for the question, because I'm not sure I know when you can stop it. I'm not sure you can. In fact, you can keep the same relationship after the release than during the investigation. Okay, that's true. And above all, when you have 50 victims, for example, but you can stop it like that. You have to maybe to bring more and more distance with the time, and progressively everybody understands that it's maybe time to have more space between you and the survivors. And for the survivors, you are not so important as you were, because they find other resources, they discovered the other victims, for example. That's very important. That's a point. Very often they don't know each other. When you lead an investigation without a lawsuit, for example, they don't know who are the other survivors. And in that case, after the release, you can put them together. You can, and it's very important, because they can speak together, and it's very helpful for them. They can, very often the survivors meet activists or lawyers or special psychologists after the release, so they don't need the same relationship with the journalist as they were during this investigative job. But I don't know if there is a right moment, and in my experience, it never stopped. In fact, it's now very distant for some stories, but we still have a relationship. It happens sometimes they call just to have, okay, to say hello, to say, okay, I remember of that point. And okay, it's not very often, it's not invasive, but I think it's important to have to keep this relationship. It's important as journalists too, not just as human beings. It's important because it reminds us that our responsibility as journalists when we release the story is huge, and because you can see the consequences of a publication during weeks, months, years, and for me it's a great reminder.
Sophia, do I need to repeat the question?
No, thank you. I remember the questions. So I did a lot of reading, like read a lot of books about gender, about feminism. And the more story you cover, the more survivors you talk to, you will know the patterns. It's about the power. It's not about sex. It's about the power, about equality, about the women being discriminated, and discrimination against the sex, and the violence based on sex, on gender. So, and then when I do a lot of investigation, I saw the pattern is most of the time those the abuse was from men to women, and from the people in power to those people, to the survivors who has a disadvantaged position compared to them. So you will see that like that come back to the reasons why the whole system is not providing enough supporting network, by not providing the hotlines, not the organization, the NGOs, the social workers, like the everything like this supposed to provide. So, and you see that those men, mostly men, get away. They don't pay enough price for sexual harass or abuse women. So after all these, you will know that this is not a question about sex, about gender. It's a question about power. Who is in the power, and their power are not being checked. So they get this power, they can do what they want, and they don't pay enough price. Yeah, that's what I would like to share.
I think you're muted, Eunice.
Yes, this mute button is tricky. Next, I think this question could be directed to Ashwaq because it's someone from Sri Lanka. This person says that there are many abuse cases in Sri Lanka, but no one comes forward because of the culture and because the level of belief in survivors or victims are low. So how can journalists expose abuse cases in such an environment? And if I may squeeze in another question, which is kind of related to the system, two people asked, how do you confront the perpetrators of sexual abuse during investigation? Do you have any advice for approaching these institutions? Because, you know, some institutions, they have this history of fostering impunity for sexual abuse crimes, and they could just shut journalists up by claiming that, oh, we are conducting internal investigations and this is a private matter. Yep. So Ashwaq, would you want to go first?
Sure. I think in a lot of cases, what's happened with me is, for example, I was once trying to find, I was doing a story on human trafficking. So looking at not just, sex trafficking, but also bride trafficking, which is a phenomenon that's happening in Northern India, particularly where women are brought in from literally like people pay to get wives. But in one of the cases, what was happening is, I'm not concerned about trafficking here, but in one of the cases, what was happening was that I went for a story and I went with an NGO which was working on education of women. And that is how I enter these spheres. I'm not lying to them that I'm doing a story. I'm telling the woman what I'm doing, but I'm not exactly telling her family members what exactly we are doing. So I go through with like a community worker who's a woman, a health worker who's a woman, or an NGO which is working on education. So that sort of helps me bypass through those complicated situations. But in this particular case, for example, I went and I started talking to this one woman who was the wife of, there are 3 brothers in the house and a father, and she's the wife of the son and the oldest son. So what she was telling me while I was talking to the entire family about education of women and what she's daughters and what she was doing, I was talking to her too, and she kind of wanted to speak. So I'm saying about the cultural thing, there were her family members were right there, her father-in-law, her brother-in-law were there, and she could not speak up in front of them. But I did understand that there was something she wanted to say, which is, she was bride trafficked was something that the entire village knew about. But what I was concerned about is what is happening after that. It's because it had been a while that she was trafficked. So the woman gave hints, which I had to like sort of pick on, like something like she said that, oh, what cream do you apply on your face? It really smells good. And then I said, oh, you know what? I want to talk to you about the new creams that have come. And we just started talking about really random things. And sometimes I start talking about the cattle in their fields. So it's something that sort of takes away the men from the vicinity. And they're like, oh, they're talking about female things or something like that. So I think there are always these small tricks that you have to learn. And there's a cult, that even if it's the most pervasive of crimes, it's still the most historically silenced crime. So it's it's not easy for people to come up, but then you have to go through these networks where you're not exactly going and telling them that you're here to write against you.
Thank you. Lenaïg, do you want to take on the second question?
About the institutions?
Yes. How do you approach all these institutions who are accused of being complicit in covering up sexual abuse?
They are quite all the time complicit, in fact. I mean, as Sophia and Ashwaq very clearly explained, it's sexual abuse is a question of power and of domination. And the point is not that 1 or 2 or 3 and 100 or 1,000 abusers are they are inactive. The problem is that it's a system. It's a system of domination. It's an impunity, and when you have to have this in mind when you are calling the university, when you are calling the company, where you are calling the political party, when you are calling the union, and so on and so on, because if sexual abuse is still so important in our societies, it's because someone covered the abusers, someone or a system. Okay. Someone kept the guy there. Someone decided that he's not gonna be punished for what he did before. Someone said, okay, we don't say anything. We're gonna take the girl or the woman and we're gonna put her in another service, in another company, in another university, and we're gonna say sexual abuse is not a problem in our institutions. So if I can say how I do, is that I call the institutions with a lot of I'm very careful. In fact, I don't say what I have. I don't say with who I spoke. I don't say anything of the materials I have in this investigation. I just said, okay, I have questions, and I have a lot of questions to understand why there is no punishment, why there is no why someone covered him, etc. But I don't say, I don't give any clue on who talked to me and who are my sources.
Very good advice there. Sophia, anything to add?
Yeah, a little bit. Like most of the time, at the first beginning, I don't approach the institution, the university, the authority at the first beginning. I will approach some people or some leaks or some people who have an empathy about this sexual abuse, sexual violence. I will talk to some like female professors or the vice president, like just sneak around, like, do you know there's something like that? Like sometimes they will leak some information to you. When I get enough leaks from them, I will question the authority and I will tell them like, oh, I got some survivors. Of course, I will protect their identity and who they are. I will tell them I had how many survivors here, and I had their testimony. I collect the evidence. I'm going to publish this article. So you are going to tell me what you are going to do. And I need to do the fact check. So sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just decline the interview. Sometimes they said, no, there's nothing going on. But most of the time in mainland China, when you say you're going to publish this article, they will do two things. One, trying to stop you they will go to like the National Security Department, but they need time. And sometimes they will threaten you like, oh, if you are going to publish this article, I'm going to do this and that. And all those response I will read them, also write them into my articles. So most of the time it worked. After the publishing the article, they will correct their mistakes. So just like that, how I did it. I hope it helps.
I think, Eunice, we're going to do one more round of questions.
Yes. I guess Sophia knows personally about this because some questions came in about personal safety. When you're a journalist reporting on such issues, do you face such threats? And how do you protect yourselves? And how do you manage such stories from affecting you physically, emotionally, or mentally? So it's not just about dealing with the trauma of the survivors, but also the journalist trauma as well. And I think there was one more about sexual abuse cases that happened years and years ago. Is there any differences in how you would pursue the investigation? Anything extra that should be done compared to a current case?
Sophia, you're muted. All right.
Okay, I hear myself. Sorry again. For me, it's quite challenging to really talk. I mean, had to handling my own issues like my traumas and all these happening in my personal life. But to be honest, like most survivors, I feel empowered and inspired the more people I talk to, the more experience you got. That is something you had to face living in China. So I don't say that I already handle all those perfectly. I mean, I deal with it every day, every single day, but still trying to writing, publishing articles, and talking to survivors really empower myself. And I keep telling myself, like, reporting is your life and you need to do this, and this all will help you and will empower more women coming forward. It did, actually. So I'm not saying that I'm perfectly handled it well. I had to say that I'm still surviving. So I'm not sure whether I answer your question or not. And coming back to the second question, is like how you chase the stories like happens decades ago. That's very, very challenging, to be honest. That's like decades ago, you don't have any evidence at all. And only you have is their stories, their memories. And memories sometimes will be like become a little fuzzy after all this time because their trauma, the humiliation, sometimes, to be honest, sometimes they lie too. So that is not easy to portray the story, but still we will try as many ways as we can. We will still talk to their friends like, do you remember many years ago this happening? And I will do more thinking about the accuser. The accused, I will do more of the thinking about that, because most people, those are repeat offenders. They are not doing it for one time. Sometimes they do it a few times, and you have to dig more and more. Just talk to a lot of their colleagues, like maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I don't know whether we will succeed, but we had to try. That's if you got one source and it will lead you to another. So you just had to keep trying. So sometimes I spend 6 months on one case or 3 months in one case. So sometimes it depends on your luck. But the very important thing is, if you don't publish the article without solid evidence to back the article, when the survivors talk to you, when you do all this interview, it's a process of empowering. And those survivors will be understand, like, if you can publish it, but they will still feel like, oh, thank you so much, because I got a lot of inspiration. A lot of survivors sharing me like, oh, I don't care whether you publish the article or not. I'm just happy that, and I feel empowered that you are listening to me, and I feel myself being respected, and that's what matters. And they can get back to their life much better after all these. Thank you.
I think on that note, Sophia, you've said something there that I think all of us who've done some of this work can share, which is not only can we be inspired by the women and men who we've met along the way, but actually often the survivors are also inspired by the fact that we've invested our commitment and our time in doing these sort of stories. And certainly from our own story, the number of times I've heard either from audience members or the women themselves say, I think that just doing the story was the journey that I needed in order to keep moving forward. And justice is a very complicated thing. It isn't necessarily a straight line, right? So I'm really sorry to everybody online. We've run out of time. And before I close, though, I would like to thank everybody at GIJN, everybody in the audience, and of course, most of all, a big thank you to Lenaïg, Ashwaq, and Sophia for everything you do. And also, while you're on and I have your attention, I wanted to point out that we have 2 more GIJN webinars coming up. The next 2 are, we're going to have one on investigating health and medicine during the time of COVID, and that one is on September 21st, Saturday, 21st of November, and another one on Thursday, the 3rd of December. So you can catch all of the details on that if you follow the Twitter feed and the other social channels of global investigative journalism. So on that note, I want to thank all our speakers. I want to thank Eunice for the questions, and most of all to David and Anne for setting all this up. Thank you so much to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.